Sí, sí, ella té traducció.
Vale, sí, nosaltres parlem en català i això, val, d'acord, doncs. Comencem quan vulgueu, comencem.
Okay, we're going to start. Yes, Xavier, please go ahead. Thank you very much. We are going to start this panel discussion, the last panel discussion today, with the topic Decolonizing Heritage. The topic is very timely and it's related to the interpretation of heritage as an element that speaks about colonialism. So this whole idea of heritage has been laid on the table in previous interventions related to different movements, such as demonstrations in front of museums or in front of monuments, and this has become a symbol of colonialism, of today's colonialism, and the understanding of what colonialism is about. So this is the topic at hand today. We are going to have 3 different speakers, and this means that we will have the possibility to see different perspectives. Chiara, the Cesari, professor from Amsterdam University. She holds a BA in anthropology, and she has published a long list of articles on the topic of heritage and how heritage interacts with colonial processes. She will be speaking about how museums have been contested in different parts of Europe, and she will be speaking about the debate on the topic of decolonization. She's working in the Netherlands, where there is an important contestation of this form of monuments. Of course, our museums in Catalonia are far from this idea of going back to the communities of origin or sending back the objects to the communities of origin. But of course, this will allow us to, well, for those who don't know, Amsterdam, the Tropen Museum, a former colonial museum, has been reinvented, and now it has become a museum that underlines the importance of decolonization, and it has opened a reflection about interculturality and cultural diversity. So we're going to start with Chiara's presentation first. Chiara, the floor is yours. You've got 15 minutes for the presentation. Thank you very much.
Oh. Thank you, Xavier. Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Sí, perfecto.
Sorry, I cannot hear
yes,
much. I guess it has to do with
loud and clear. Loud and clear.
That's
sorry.
Good. That's good. And sorry, I will likely take 17 minutes. I hope it's possible. I want to thank the organizers and very much for inviting me to be part of this really interesting conversation. And unfortunately, I cannot give a talk in Spanish or Catalan, so I'm sorry, I will speak in my sort of international English. Thanks also, Xavier, for, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, for introducing the Tropen Museum. Indeed, what I'm going to be talking about today is part of a research and book project called Curating the Colonial that I'm doing together with Professor Wayne Modest, who is also the head of the Research Center for Material Culture at the Tropen Museum. So this is also research which is very connected to the kind of work that the museum and the sort of I would say the ecosystem of which the museum is part, belongs to. Shall I start my PowerPoint presentation? Okay, I assume you see the PowerPoint and there is no problem if I don't hear anything. So I want to start by introducing an activist intervention that is exemplary of the practices I want to address in my talk. This is a screenshot, what you see in my PowerPoint, of the Facebook live stream intervention earlier this year by Pan-African activist Mwazulu Diabanza in the Dutch Museum of Ethnography. Campaigning for reparations for colonial crimes against African people and the return of looted colonial heritage, Diabanza entered a number of French and Dutch museums and performed the return of African properties, raising attention to the violence and injustice of colonial appropriation of African art and material culture, heritage, held in European museums. Now, the question of the colonial, or what to do with the enduring legacy of colonialism in the present, has re-emerged in the last decade as a central societal question across a broad range of contexts. This renewed public visibility of the question of the colonial has deeply affected heritage museums, where a flurry of activities around colonial issues have taken place recently. The gist of my talk and what I will do in the next 15 minutes is to reflect on and call attention to how decolonizing activists and movements like the Diabanza that target museums are not only changing or trying to change museums themselves. More importantly, they are also suggesting new ways of thinking and acting the political by way of culture, of doing politics otherwise. From my location in the Netherlands, and my location in the Netherlands as something who comes from a sort of a set of other places, I was struck by the ways in which in the last 10 years, heritage and museums have played an important role in key debates about central societal issues like race, structural racism and exclusion. Now, I don't have time to go into it, but in the Netherlands in the last 10 years, there has been a major debate around the Dutch Santa Claus, which is exactly this week, which has partly changed the ways in which structural racism is negotiated in the public sphere. And this thanks to activists and artists like Diabanza. But museums, if we can talk about, it's a very long story, of course, but we can talk about it in the discussion. Museums in particular are rather interesting sites to enact the anti-racist struggle, also because they were born out of the intersection of colonialism, nationalism, and the development of the nation state and capitalism a couple of centuries ago, and continue to reproduce a set of race, class, and gender distinctions and structural exclusions, and particularly colonial taxonomies. Museums have been historically foremost colonial institutions. What I will argue in the following is that museums are sites of a set of contradictions and failures, of a certain impossibility to be decolonized, that nevertheless opens up a number of potentialities. And here I'm using a term by Ariella Zulay, who has written one of the probably most interesting books on colonial heritage in museums in recent years. So these transformations have largely happened through the agency of diasporas and minorities and second, third generations post-colonial citizens. So the outside of the title of my paper that is increasingly pushing in and forcing the museum to take up uncomfortable positions vis-a-vis their own history and way of functioning in the past and present. So in this paper, I will briefly discuss a number of museums in Europe and beyond that are being transformed by such struggles around colonial heritage and racism in different countries in Europe and beyond, because these movements, of course, go well beyond Europe and often originates in the global South. as the case of the Avanza shows. So in what follows, I will focus on, please keep these two main points in mind that are the, are sort of the key points of what I want to say. First of all, the question of the impossibility of decolonizing the museum and the possibilities that come out of this impossibility. And second, the role of so-called art activists. If museums are at their roots colonial institutions, what does it mean to do the work of decolonizing precisely in and around these compromised problematic places? And who are the agents of this process? I want to continue talking about these issues through the story of a curator, Soumaya Kassim. Independent curator Soumaya, may I ask that the simultaneous translators if I'm speaking too fast?
It's fine. Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you for your work. Where was I? Okay, independent curator Soumaya Kassim made a public statement following her collaboration in 2017 with the Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery on an exhibition called The Past is Now, which, like several similar exhibitions across Europe these days, was meant to reassess the colonial past, in this case of the British Empire, and its impact on the present. Soumaya Kassim was part of a group of young curators of colors who had been invited by the museum to work on these exhibitions on the colonial past. This project was fraught with all sorts of problems and failures, which Soumaya poignantly describes in her statement. This is a piece she published based on her experience. So the museum will not be decolonized. This is the title of Soumaya Kassim's story of her participation in the Birmingham Museum work. This highlights the basic predicaments of the broader project of decolonizing the museum, which has been called for increasingly in recent times. Kassim finished her work for the Birmingham exhibition, but the final lesson for her is straightforward. The museum will not be decolonized. To reinforce her point, she mobilizes the powerful words of Audre Lorde. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. End of quote. While many museums and cultural institutions today champion decolonial thinking or say they want to decolonize, and still many do not, let us be clear, in fact, for Kassim, and here I'm quoting her article online, museums are so embedded in the history and power structures that decoloniality challenges that they will only end up co-opting decoloniality. End of quote. So in what follows, I will argue that museums do offer, at least in some places and under certain conditions, active platforms for rethinking the presence and work of colonialism in the fabric of our lives, not in spite, but perhaps precisely because of the tensions, contradictions, and failures analyzed by Kassim. As museums proliferate, along with calls to decolonize them becoming more vocal and visible in the public sphere, these institutions often fail to represent the presence and ongoing ruination of colonialism, to use Ernst Stoller apt metaphor, or the afterlives of colonialism, as Saidiya Artman put it, with projects that are both unsatisfactory and problematic as they are necessary. Now, before I show you a couple of examples, and here you have my key points listed on the slides, I want to clarify two theoretical points that I won't have too much time to go into detail, to describe in detail, but I think it's important for me to emphasize now. First of all, let me briefly clarify my use of the term failure and impossibility, or rather possibility, impossibility. When I speak of museums' failures, I understand failure along the lines of recent theorizing in queer studies. That is, as the effect of structural conditions rather than sort of individual wrongdoings. Most importantly, I see failure also as a productive condition, at least in part, as triggering inventive solution, a launching pad for alternatives, and prompting the questioning of established models. My thinking on the impossibility of decolonizing the museum has also been shaped by Derrida's discussion of the possible impossible, namely an event that is at once possible and impossible. An impossible, and here I'm quoting Derrida, that is not merely impossible, that is not merely the opposite of the possible, but that is also the condition of the possible. So if we apply Derrida's argument, yes, museums very often fail to adequately represent colonialism and the violence of colonialism. Yet what they do is inadequate, probably always already, but they need to keep doing it. So using Samuel Beckett's words, they should try again, and fail better. How much time do I have? Another. Do I have, sorry, 10 minutes, 5 minutes?
Yeah.
I think you can go on, Chiara, until
Please
Xavier.
go on until
Okay.
Xavier says otherwise.
Okay. I just want to, so the question, I wanted to, so signaling a growing interest in making colonial histories more visible, several museums across Europe have recently renewed or are in the process of renewing their colonial exhibits. Of course, COVID has stopped many of them. In particular, these as museums that have been engaging their colonial past have been in particular ethnographic and historical museums in various European countries and beyond, and also another field and another set of museums that have been at the forefront of dealing with issues of colonialism are particularly is the field of contemporary art, and not so much art museums, but contemporary art centers. This turn comes in response to increasing critiques from diverse quarters, particularly Black and minority activists and academics, for institutional change. While this new attention is a positive development, it has raised a series of questions around the limits of this kind of engagement with the colonial. Art activists, that is, artists and activists coming from minorities and post-colonial communities, play very important roles in movement to decolonize museums, but also in the broader push for a full reckoning with the colonial as a powerful historical force constituting our present. Initiatives such as Decolonize displays in New York, Berlin Postcolonial in Germany, and Decolonize the museums in the Netherlands share a set of common features. In particular, they often target museums within a broader range of strategies and objectives, from urban gentrification to more traditional sociopolitical issues such as racism and inequalities produced by capitalism. Museums are privileged targets, that is, key battlefields and pressure points or entry points into a broader institutional structure marked by structural exclusion. So art activists are changing cultural institutions, not only in the global north, but also in the global south, where artists and activists have voiced similar aspirations for museums and cultural institutions to be constituted in new radically democratic ways. And now I want to show you a couple of examples. This is an example from the Netherlands, is a contemporary art center that was named after the street it is located in, which was named after a colonial general. And this was actually not, this striking aspect was not talked about until a series of anti-racist activists a few years ago basically pointed at the hypocrisy of exhibitions about colonialism and racism being held inside this contemporary art center that was whose name was devoted to a colonial general. And this triggered a major political debate within the institution and in the broader public in Rotterdam, and now the place has changed its name. Another example, this is the Tropen Museum, you have already mentioned, the Dutch National Museum of World Culture, which has been going through a series of major transformations in recent years, also thanks to the input and pressure of groups such as Decolonizing the museums in the Netherlands and a series of a number of activists, anti-racist activists in the Netherlands, and is recently in the process of rethinking its major exhibition on colonialism, which will no longer be the classic ethnographic exhibit, but will focus on the role of colonialism in the present. And here is the Afterlives of Slavery exhibition, which was a little bit of the testing ground for the future semi-permanent exhibition that will open in 2022, and which again took a completely different approach to the exhibition of what we call ethnographic objects. And here you see Gloria Wekker, an important academic theorist and anti-racist activist in the Netherlands, who took a very important role in the exhibition. This is also another important figure of the anti-racist struggle in the Netherlands. And this is the reaction, in a way, by the official national institutions of the Netherlands. In 2017, the Rijksmuseum, which is the major national museum of art and history in the Netherlands, the one where, which houses the Rembrandts and the Vermeer, announced that it was going to inaugurate an exhibition on slavery in 2020, now it's going to be next year, and encourage all other Dutch museums to participate in a broader campaign to engage with the colonial past. This is the Humboldt Forum in Berlin. Another actually is the Humboldt Forum is a new museum in the center of Berlin, supposed to represent the new Germany. It's a very important national project, and it will house also, the plan is to house also the ethnographic collection of Berlin, and this generated a series of public debates and contestations by initiatives such as Berlin Postcolonial, and it has, in a way, actually not in a way, it has been a major factor and a major platform for reintroducing the topic of the legacy of colonialism and the question of racism, structural racism in German societies, representation about German society that has played a major role in the national public sphere as a whole. Again, here we see sort of the museum-ish debate within the museum through the agency of the active sort of spilling over into the broader public sphere. Actually, Italy, and probably, if I don't know much about Spain, but I think Italy and Spain are sort of similar cases. In Italy, actually, this has not happened yet. The colonial past is still largely silenced, except for a number of grassroots activist initiatives such as the MAM, which I do not have much time to go into, but in Italy, actually, this push and this sort of this phenomenon of major sort of museum being turned into sort of political platforms, for talking about core socio-political issues of our society. This has not happened, at least not yet, even though the debate about colonialism is emerging. And I think this has to do with the fact that there is no decolonial movement in Italy, or not yet a strong decolonial movement. Another example from outside of Europe, where museums are sort of constituting important platforms for debates around colonial issues and platform for rethinking sort of the political along with the colonial question together. This is Palestine, Ramallah, where museums and different arts and cultural initiatives are playing here some examples, some picks out of the Palestinian biennials, and are playing an important role in rethinking not only our notions of the museums, but also broader political issues through cultural lenses. So this is these are what I wanted to say. I basically sort of to summarize the gist of my talk. Heritage and museums are transforming into significant platforms of public political debate, where societal problems are made visible, negotiated, and acted upon. And this is happening thanks to the mobilization of a new generation of art activists and committed post-colonial citizens who have reinvented a set of distinctive creative cultural political tactics, such as the one by Diabansa that I have opened my talk with. So of course, I want to close my talk with a series of questions, because these endeavors pose a number of questions, such as whether this critical work is whether and how this critical work is fashioning new forms of institutions, what is happening with COVID, which is also shaping, transforming our political field and our institutions, cultural institutions. And and what is the broader social and political significance of these cultural tactics to decolonize the museum? Thank you for listening, and apologies if I took a little bit more time.
Sí. Bé, doncs, moltes gràcies. No tinc el
Thank you very much. My camera is not connected. My apologies. It's not me. Somebody disconnected my video. In any case, we will now give the floor to the next intervention by Gustavo Nerin. And as you know, he's a historian and anthropologist, specialist in the colonial history of Spain and Africa, of Western Guinea, the last colony that Spain had besides the Sahara, and which means that he's been working and dwelling on these questions. He was a professor at Western Guinea on questions related to political and economic aspects. He's going to talk about the complex dialects between restitution and plundering. Thank you very much. Thank you, Xavier. Thank you, the EUROM and the Municipality of Barcelona for giving me the opportunity to participate in these conferences, especially to talk about Guinea, which is maybe the closest space we have of plundering, colonial plundering that started by natural resources, continue with the workplace, which has devastated all the aspects, and it also reached art and labor. The plundering of patrimony in other parts of Africa has happened also in Equatorial Guinea. It went through different phases of direct plundering and has gone through more subtle phases, which already exist. I don't think that it cannot resist a colonial governor when they are requesting you to deliver a specific piece. You are a subordinate and you don't have the possibility to say no. And we think that many of the pieces that were taken from Equatorial Guinea, which is part of the public and private patrimony of Spain nowadays, are pieces that not only were artistic pieces or works of art, but pieces with another value. They were not conceived as a work of art, but maybe they were part of the ritual objects with a high symbolic value. The most emblematic case is the African art of figures with mud or clay statues. And well, in reality, these were some small statues which were used in order to worship the ancestors. They were used to worship the ancestors, and periodically they were taking the skulls of these ancestors, and these statues represented the life of the ancestors, and they were taken only when there were serious problems such as incest, and they were kept in the forest, and only certain people could take these statues. They were nice, but they were not a piece of art, a work of art in the sense that we understand, but it called the attention of the colonial administrators, and there was a massive plundering. These clay statues can be found everywhere. They are part of the collections of Africa all over the place, and they were determined by the emergence of Cubism. Picasso and Matisse had seen this art before doing their pieces. Therefore, there was systematic plundering of art in Central Africa, and also with clay statues. But there is a peculiarity. Spanish policies were not similar to the British or other policies, and this led to a different management of the heritage. The first attempt by Spain in 1856 was an attempt to colonize, which didn't bring civil servants, no military, which is sending to Guinea priests and missionaries. And the obsession of the Spanish colonialism was sending missionaries, which is a process which is very strong. Not only did they want the Guinean people to be submitted to the Spanish authorities, but they wanted them to stop acting the way they were doing and to convert from a religious perspective and family perspective into something else. The 1856 project failed, but when the first Spanish governor arrived there together with the Jesuits, and then later they sent the Claretians, and all of them will be marked by an attitude of aggressivity. And the missions, which will be the negotiating between the Guinean people and the colonizing powers, will try to reform the cultural, family, and religious life of people of Guinea, and this will cause a systematic destruction of the heritage which was related to religious. This happened in Nowon, although they're Christians, but they have some chapels that they're not considered to be Catholic, and they were destroyed. They were considered to be superstitions. The only ones that have some animist cult with some menhirs, in some cases these menhirs were also destroyed, and through the Milano boxes where they keep the skulls of the ancestors were systematically destroyed. The missionaries used the children of the missions to localize the families, and they were the ones identifying the families, keeping skulls from their ancestors, and they asked them to tell them where they are, and they send the colonial guard that will torture people. They were tortured with a couple of pieces of wood, pressing their heads until they deliver these statues. But in many cases, these statues were not kept, but were destroyed. And in this case, I think that the most important characteristic of the Spanish colonialism in Guinea, Morocco is something different, is not the plundering of the heritage, but the pure destruction. The Fang had these statues, which are highly valued if you see them in the museums of Germany, and some has been audited for more than 1 million euros. But if we go to the Spanish museum, the Patrimonial is smaller. In fact, the plundering of the heritage reflects the global plundering suffered by the people from Guinea. The population was even taken away their names, and now some of them are called Gerona, Sabadell or Bayovera. Or, for example, a systematic aggression on practices related to the body. They are wearing beautiful tattoos. The colonization ended with the practice of tattoos through persecution, or the scars they had on their face. This disappear completely with the cynical aspect after they are obliged to eliminate it. Before the independence, the Spanish people decided to create a Guinean virgin, and they painted with these symbols, the same symbols that the colonial policy made disappear. In this way, there is no survival of much of the colonial heritage or pre-colonial heritage in Guinea. Talking about segmentarian statues, there were not big construction of stones, and therefore they didn't have many enduring objects, and therefore there was also a massive destruction of what they had. This doesn't mean that there was no plundering. There was very specific cases of huge plundering. The Claretians, for example, had the tradition of organizing meetings among people and cremating liturgic objects, but they did not burn all of them. Some of them went into a museum by the Claretians near Madrid at the central residence they have, and nowadays we don't know exactly where they are. It's a complete plundering, archaeological plundering, incredible. The practice of ceramics, for example, there are very antique ceramics all over Sevilla, and part of these ceramic deposits were in the hands of private collections of tourists recovering fragments of ceramics, which probably in the end, part of it went into the garbage. There was another important case. One of the great collectors of art of Equatorial Guinea, someone who had spent many years in the colony, obtained in a not very clear way part of his artistic collection. In fact, this Spanish person who was installed in Guinea knew a family of artists, famous artists with a tradition of Guinean art. And one of the members of this family was leader of the majority party in the region. And occasionally he was arrested by the Chea, who was the head of the colonial guard in the area. And this art collector interceded in order for him to be free. And in exchange of this freedom, he was always visiting the family in order to obtain some works of art. So in this way, that was the way he was collecting the favor. So we realized that part of the artistic heritage, but not only artistic, but symbolic and ritual in Guinea, is in Spanish museums. And it's completely out of context. That is to say, a piece of art that's only those participating in this and was used only in specific celebrations. Now we find it in place where nobody has been before, in a showcase. Vieres is not a culture of the funk. In reality, the Viere was heritage. Part of the family, the Viere, represented a specific ancestor, and the only ones who could touch this PLA were their specific family members. It was not a religion which could be transferred to other people. Worshipping the predecessors means that you have to listen to that specific person. And in this case, of course, those Vieres have become completely orphan because this disappeared in the 30s and now it's completely absent, disappear. Having said that, after all this plundering, we have to take into account that part of what we find nowadays in collections with a certain prestige on Equatorial Guinea, it will be very difficult to consider this heritage. Equatorial Guinea, since 1910, we start to see a series of traders and artisans specialize in trade, living in misery, and most of them are the ones creating the masks and works of art that are sold in Equatorial Guinea. They organize some business which will last even 100 years, and they are the ones who are selling works of art that are presented towards Europeans as works of art of incredible value, but these are works of art that for the Fang do not have any meaning, not any symbolic meaning. These are works of artisans which can be bought and paid for. Well, if we pay attention not to these works of art, which cannot be considered heritage, but if we pay attention to the works of art that have been plundered, we have a basic problem. And the problem is that can they be restituted, these works of art? Who will be the depositories of the restitution? Because most of these works of art are not documented, and it will be very difficult to find the descendants of it. Secondly, we are talking about a country where now there is not even one museum, not even one institution dedicated to the preservation and restitution and the study of antique works of art. No museum, no room, no public entity that can preserve it. Let me give you an example reflecting these problems. Towards 2010, we found in the island of Corisco a series of works of art from the iron phase, and the people of the island tried to contact an archaeologist. And they did some emergency work of digging, and they tried to do a decolonize project. They tried to add the local population to the knowledge of what had been there. And secondly, the project was not to take away any of the pieces they will found there, but to leave it for the exhibition in Equatorial Guinea. Well, the first part was done, not the second one, because the government of Equatorial Guinea did not receive these works of art by saying that there was no room with enough air conditioning or humidity to keep them. These fragile works of art were kept in Guinea, not in the ideal place, and they had suffered an accelerated process of deterioration and damage, and some of them are lost. With this dynamic of restitution, sometimes it's difficult. Up until today, the government of Guinea has not asked for the restitution or devolution of their heritage. They had not even had devotion for the heritage existing in the country. For example, the architectonic heritage, part of the architectonic heritage has been destroyed. For example, we have an architectonic heritage of the Fernandina houses in the capital, which has been systematically destroyed. And this is a destruction of part of the history of a whole group of Equatorial Guinea. Therefore, we have this problem. And the problem is that in the end, we are not completely sure that a restitution could go directly towards an institution with public ends. Some of them have not gone in the hands of public institution, but in the hands, in private hands. So in the end, the problem we are facing is that even in the case that we have a hypothetical restitution, for example, the Vieres, we will not count on them. We will just return carcasses, because in Bilan is the religion around the Viere has disappeared completely because there has been a bigger destruction than the patrimony, but the destruction of a whole culture. Thank you very much, Gustau, for adjusting to the time and for presenting this absolutely different dynamics. The first intervention was telling us how from the Europe we take a look at the heritage, and now from the autochthonous perspective and the difficulties of restitution that you were mentioning. But we can talk about this. Let's continue now with the next intervention and the next speaker and last one. And also Chiara has to leave. Therefore, we have to go fast. We will listen to Mónica Martínez, anthropologist, teacher, and neighbor. because she's next door in my office. And wait a second, she's going to speak from another perspective, which will be basically as an expert in management of tourism and the different markets for the cooperation of development and cultural situation. And she's part of the group of Indigenous cultures of the Department of Anthropology. And she will speak
indígenes a Amèrica Llatina una nova forma de colonialisme. Per tant, passem d'Àfrica a Amèrica, no? I canviem doncs, de continent, però amb el mateix substrat que ens guia, doncs, com és com doncs, el colonialisme doncs, està present en aquests contextos patrimonials. Endavant quan vulguis.
Moltes gràcies, Xavier, i bona tarda, bona vesprada a tots. Suposo que se'm sent bé i es veu bé la projecció del PowerPoint. Sí?
Sí, es veu perfecte.
Sí, en aquestes modalitats Black Mirror sempre va bé que sentir una veu que ve d'aquest més enllà. Llavors, gràcies. Bé, també volia començar agraint a la Celeste i al Ricard per haver-me convidat i per haver organitzat aquestes jornades tan interessants. He pogut estar avui a la tarda sentint les altres ponències i realment ha estat molt ric. També agrair al Born Centre Cultural, a la Regidoria de Memòria Democràtica i a l'Observatori EUROM per també l'organització i crear aquest marc de debat, aquest marc de discussió, de reflexió acadèmica i també ciutadana. I bé, sense enrotllar-me gaire, aniré bastant al gra, perquè de fet sí que se'm va demanar que parlés d'aquesta apropiació indeguda de dissenys, de símbols, que és un tema certament complex i que crec que en 15 minuts simplement podrem fer una petita pinzellada. És un tema que toca de ple aquesta economia cultural del segle XXI, marcada per aquesta creixent globalització, etnicització, que ha promogut la mercantilització de productes associats a determinades cultures indígenes. Fins ara hem parlat de museus, hem parlat de patrimoni. Del que jo us parlaré són d'aquests objectes que moltes vegades són anomenats artesanies, que produeixen pobles indígenes i comunitats locals arreu del món i que un dia, sense esperar-s'ho gaire, es troben en contextos completament deslocalitzats. Llavors, el context d'aquestes apropiacions indegudes és aquest mercat global, és aquest capitalisme i tenim molt clar, com ja ens deia el García Canclini fa molts anys, als anys 80, que el capitalisme no ha avançat eliminant les cultures tradicionals, sinó que el que ha fet és apropiar-se d'elles, ha reorganitzat els seus significats, la funció dels seus subjectes, de les seves creences, de les seves pràctiques, i això fa que avui ens trobem.
It means, excuse me, a technical. Chiara cannot hear translation? You don't hear us, Chiara? Hello, 1, 2, 3, testing. Can you hear me?
Espero que no parli molt ràpid. Sí,
No, it's okay, sorry.
Llavors, aquests objectes que es troben comercialitzats per pel capitalisme global i que realment ha donat un nou valor. També hem de tindre molt clar que hi ha moltes aproximacions a aquest fenomen des de l'anomenada economia de l'autenticitat, de la Natalie Heinrich, o la mercantilització d'allò autèntic, del que ens parla també Boltanski, Chapeló, fins i tot el mateix Joan Frigoler, professor del nostre Departament d'Antropologia, que també ha parlat de la ideologia de l'autenticitat, de com els béns i els valors culturalment definits han adquirit en el moment actual un nou valor. Bé, aquests són alguns treballs que venen de l'antropologia, des del clàssic ja del Make It Brown, de qui pertany la cultura nativa, fins a altres debats que toquen no tant el tema del patrimoni, sinó la propietat intel·lectual. De qui són aquests objectes que es troben en el mercat internacional i que molesten a les comunitats locals que produeixen aquests objectes. I aquest és el tema clau aquí. parlem d'apropiació indeguda quan un objecte que és produït, un disseny que és elaborat per una comunitat local es troba de cop i volta al mercat internacional comercialitzat per un dissenyador, una dissenyadora de moda, com l'exemple que tenim aquí, que és un dels més famosos de la Isabella Marant, que és una dissenyadora francesa, que va incloure un model de blusa en la seva col·lecció, que va resultar ser una còpia d'una camisa tradicional de l'àrea de Oaxaca, concretament de la Santa Maria Trautecupec, i que van anunciar la Susana House. Llavors, aquest és un cas molt conegut on, de cop i volta, una comunitat indígena veu que aquella camisa que està produint, que és un signe d'identitat, està formant part d'una col·lecció de moda que està desfilant per les passareles i, a més, es ven amb uns preus desorbitats, que és aquí on també hi ha un sentiment que no agrada a les comunitats, on hi ha una despossessió i senten que hi ha hagut una apropiació indeguda. Són molts els exemples a Mèxic en qüestions tèxtils, n'hi ha una bona col·lecció. Llavors tenim, per exemple, el cas de Rhapsody, que també és acusat de plagiar una blusa tradicional de Sant Antonino Castillo Velasco. També un exemple també molt ric és el dels tenangos, que són aquest tipus de bordat mexicà, que es troba també reproduït en col·leccions de Carolina Herrera, de Luis Butón, de Mango, que els han utilitzat sense demanar autorització i els han incorporat a les seves col·leccions sense pensar que això tenia un significat, que tenia un context cultural concret. Molts són els exemples a Mèxic, també aquesta blusa plagiada per Zara, però no només a Amèrica, també aquí tenim casos, per exemple, aquest del poble gallec de Viana del Bolo, que acusa també a Dolce i Gabbana per haver plagiat la blusa que ells utilitzen en el seu Carnestoltes. Bé, veiem que els exemples són molts, però sí que criden molt l'atenció en aquests contextos indígenes per la desproporció. Estem davant de grans marques que estan utilitzant dissenys indígenes que són localment produïts amb finalitats moltes vegades rituals. A part dels textils, també un altre exemple bastant prolífic és el de les aerolínies que utilitzen símbols indígenes per decorar avions. Aquí tenim el cas de Fiji Airways, que utilitza aquests dissenys anomenats Masi, que són típics de les illes del Pacífic, de diverses cultures, i que també hi ha una apropiació, perquè això s'acaba convertint en una marca. Una marca que en el seu origen aquests Masi no han estat concebuts per decorar avions, sinó que formaven part d'una ritualitat, d'un element de cohesió grupal, etc. Llavors també denúncies perquè això no toca, és una apropiació indeguda. Un altre cas, el del símbol del sol, del Pueblo Dia, també això és als Estats Units, mateix cas, de cop i volta l'aerolínia Southwest agafa aquest símbol, evidentment sense demanar permís a ningú, i evidentment diu, escolteu, aquí això no toca, això és una cosa que representa, forma part de la nostra identitat i no toca que estigui exportant un avió. També a vegades és difícil, quan parlem d'identitat, quan parlem d'apropiacions indegudes, a vegades ens costa entendre els límits d'això. Per exemple, aquí tenim una campanya de Xile, d'uns grans magatzems, i faig moltes propagandes de molta gent, però bé, és per il·lustrar. Llavors, tenim aquí uns grans magatzems que treuen un producte que és una llana i que donen visibilitat a les teixidores indígenes i, a més, són productes que han estat també elaborats per aquestes dones. I aquí trobem, novament, què estem aquí? Davant d'una apropiació indeguda o aquí de la utilització d'aquests sabers tradicionals, d'aquestes dones teixidores per vendre? Aquí tenim també, són molts els exemples també, aquí tenim un altre exemple que no vindria a ser una apropiació indeguda,
would not be considered
com les hem presentat
misappropriation, as
anteriorment,
we've seen
perquè sí
before,
que hi ha
because in this
participació
case there is a certain
de les
participation
productores,
of
en
the
aquest cas
local
les
producers.
artesanes,
In this
que
case, the
teixeixen
artisans that
aquestes, per exemple,
sue
col·leccions de la
these
marca Both, que és
collections
una
for the Both
companyia que es troba als
brand.
Estats Units i que
Both is
comercialitza
an American
teixits
company that
produïts a Xile per
trades
dones Mapuche
Chilean
amb
tissues
símbols
produced
maputxes
by
i
Mapuche
que
women with Mapuche
no
symbols.
estan fets amb llana d'ovella, la
And,
majoria estan fets amb
well,
alpaca, tenen aquesta
they are produced with alpaca.
plus, no, podríem dir.
They are
Però
high quality,
també,
one could
novament,
say.
aquí
But once
això es
again,
converteix en una font
this
de
becomes
treball
a source
digne
of
per a aquestes dones, però al
dignified
mateix temps
work
també
for these women,
hi ha,
but at the
podríem
same
dir, un
time,
espoli de
one could say that
dissenys,
there
de
is a certain
símbols
misappropriation of
tradicionals
the
que
design, of
són
the traditional symbols,
exposats
etc.,
i
which are
creats, recreats en
exposed
aquestes passarel·les
and
internacionals.
recreated in
Bé,
this
també un altre cas
international
famós, aquest
fashion
del bolso
passerelles.
del
Here
Louis
we have
Vuitton, no? que
this Louis
també les
Vuitton
productores,
handbag. The
en aquest cas,
producers,
aquestes
in this
dones que
case, is
feien aquests bordats
Indigenous
en aquests
women.
bolsos, doncs, en el fons, agraïen perquè el Vuitton els va pagar més, no?, que el que els hi pagaven en el mercat mexicà. Però, novament, també estem davant d'un cas on hi ha uns elements que podríem també veure que hi ha una certa apropiació. Perquè, tot i que se'ls hi paga millor aquestes dones que el que paguen segurament els mexicans, no ha guanyat més el Louis Vuitton que segurament aquestes senyores. Llavors, novament, aquí també estem en casos diversos. Altres casos també que no formen part dels teixits. Tenim el món de la gastronomia, que és fantàstic. Aquí a Europa tenim el Noma, que també és aquest fantàstic restaurant que fa tot aquest revival de coneixements tradicionals antics, que rescata també llavors, arrels, elements tradicionals. O tenim aquest xef, l'Àlex Atala, que també recupera llavors, en aquest cas són les pebres que utilitzen.
Traditional pepper seeds.
Que utilitzen, és que sento un fons aquí en anglès. Bé, que recupera aquestes...
Recovers seeds and species.
Que les productores locals guanyin alguna cosa.
En
definitiva, és un tema complicat. No és, en aquest cas, patrimoni, tal com està definit.
So this is not heritage. This is considered by the convention. It could not be considered immaterial cultural heritage either, but we're speaking here about elements that the indigenous peoples consider to be their property. So we're speaking about intellectual property, and this is a very complex concept. I don't have time to elaborate on the concept, but if we go back to the classics, if we go back to Polanyi, we'll see that capitalism throughout its history has turned elements into goods. First it was the land, then it was work, and now we are experiencing a mercantilization of culture. It's becoming a property, a good. How do indigenous peoples understand intellectual property? Well, they don't really grasp the concept, because property in indigenous cultures, by the way, I found it in an Argentinian newspaper. It says judges have difficulties to understand the community element of indigenous property. In indigenous cultures, property is not private. Our regime is based today on two pillars, on two blocks, on a big dichotomy. There's on the one hand private property and what's not private, which is the commons, the public domain. And the indigenous peoples consider that this has nothing to do with them. What they do is not of public domain, so it cannot be decorating planes. And it's not a private property either, because it does not belong to a family, to an individual. It belongs to a group. It's a community element. So this aspect is very important. There is misinterpretation. So now there are important tensions between the property regimes of the indigenous peoples and the World Trade Organization, as the United Nations system, and it's very difficult to find a solution to these misappropriations of public goods produced by indigenous communities in international markets. So the situation today is the following. in the framework of the intellectual property world, there are some mechanisms, there are some international bills on intellectual property that interpret property from a very Eurocentric scope, as it tends to be the case, and they don't really take into account how 370 million indigenous inhabitants of the planet in different parts of the world have a different relationship with their goods, with their cultural production. So we are faced with a system based on author rights, labelings, brands, etc. But all this system does not take into account the collective dimension of intellectual property rights in the case of indigenous peoples, nor the collective element of the cultural productions of indigenous people. So this has not been solved. The WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, there is a work group that has tried to develop instruments to protect genetic resources, traditional knowledge, and what they have called traditional cultural expressions, which means everything and nothing, right? But no, there's no such thing as a true mechanism. I've been working in Panama, for example, where there are some legal frameworks to protect traditional indigenous cultural expressions. Now, I would like to end in 1 minute. Here's an example. Here's a picture. In Panama, there is a bill protecting the mola, this item, since the year 2000. So if you use the mola or if you use it for marketing purposes, you will have to pay royalties. But still, here's a Colombian designer who is producing high costume products without paying any royalty because it's been done in Colombia. This clip that you probably know by Vicente with Molas, it's been produced in Colombia, and the bill applies only in Panama. So what a problem. But in Panama, things are going on. So when there is misappropriation in Canada, like for example, this program, Big Brother, for sure you know it, it exists here in Europe also, and Big Brother came up with this design to self-promote itself. At the Puna, people said, no, you can't do that without first asking us and pay for the royalties. So in this case, the program said, oh, really? So we're not going to pay. So they changed the logo. But it's not always the case. For example, there's this airliner who produced this business class hygiene kit incorporating indigenous designs, and they decided to agree on a royalty. So they paid for the royalties and they used the product in their planes. Here are some other examples with a payment of royalties to indigenous peoples. The MOLA, for example, is in the United Nations, in the UN headquarters in New York, and well, the MOLA is broadcasted in a film in the interpreter. And since the MOLA is screened for 1 minute, the Puna peoples and their authorities received a royalty for this. Last example, Nike. Last year I was in Panama in May, and Nike announced the launch of these new trainers with this flashy design. Never said that this was an homage to pay tribute to Puerto Rico, and the Puna said no, this is misappropriation. 2 years after, 2 minutes after the product was withdrawn from the market. Why? Because there is a bill, because there is a collective register of intellectual property acknowledging that this is protected by intellectual property bills. Furthermore, the bill is part of the agreements that the US has reached with Panama, free trade agreements. So these free trade agreements foresee the enactment of these agreements. And Nike is an American company, so they decided to step back. So this is an exception. This case is an example, an exception, sorry. In many cases, it's not the case. Now, to respond to the question regarding whether misappropriation of designs and indigenous symbols is a way of colonialism, of course it is, absolutely so, because the League for Intellectual Property is not precisely human rights. The League of Intellectual Property is precisely defending economic resources and intellectual property. That's why it's called intellectual property. So we live in a world with a very important imbalance of power, and indigenous peoples except for the Kunas, don't have the capacity to lobby and to defend their intellectual property. And I'm going to leave it here. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mónica. Very interesting. We're going to open the Q&A session now. If you want to open the cameras, if you want to start the cameras, the three of you, please. We're going to be able to see you. And if you can stop sharing.
No esté la presentación, todos podéis abrir cámara. Xavier, tú també pots obrir la teva.
Xavier, you can also launch your camera if you want.
Bueno, podem tancar-les però no obrir-la. Ara.
Estava tancada, sí, però
Perfecte.
estaven tancades les càmeres. Bé,
Sí.
doncs molt bé. Bé, doncs moltes gràcies a tots.
Great. Thank you very much to the three
Sorry,
of you.
I cannot, it says, if I try to switch on my video, it says that I cannot switch it on because the host doesn't allow me to do so, because I think I've given permission to the host to do something with my computer. So can the
Okay,
host...
let's try to solve. Pero
Okay, yes.
initially you have to start the video.
Thank you.
Okay.
No, és que li ha passat igual que a mi.
Oh, probably you've had the same problem. You've been shut down by the host, right?
Okay.
Well, now it seems it's okay.
Vale, d'acord, ara crec que ja podem veure en galeria i ara, gràcies. Bé, doncs dic que s'han dit moltes qüestions, doncs...
Now it's better. A lot has been said. Very diverse elements have been laid on the table, but I would say that there are four main points regarding patrimonial misappropriation or appropriation. We have spoken about four different stages in history, I believe. So there's one first stage, a more historical moment that was characterized by the pillage, right, of the material goods from other continents during the colonial period in larger or lesser extent, right? More than a pillage, it was a systematic destruction of the land in some cases. And at the end of the colonial period led by states, let's say. So this meant a dramatic transfer of goods, of cultural goods, from the different continents to Europe. Even corpse and mummies were brought all the way to Europe, and the Neuchâtel launched an exhibition called Les Musées Cannibales. Even the museum had become cannibalistic. So in the case of Spain, misappropriation has been less relevant in terms of cultural elements. Unfortunately or thankfully, one doesn't really know. There are no large collections. The larger one probably is in the Museo de América, and it's not a very competitive collection in the international scene. Then there was the constitution of museums, as we've heard, museums stemming from colonialism, museums that justify colonialism by somehow broadcasting the exotic nature of other cultures. And of course, we have been now, all these museums have been now contested by different movements, by different anti-racism movements, and due to the internal need of museums. So museums decided to somehow revert the situation. And I would say that there are different ways to understand the recovery of these narratives, the classical narratives that persevere today in some museums that have kept the old-fashioned museums, old-fashioned narratives, whereas other museums have somehow kept the items, but without giving them such a big colonialist approach or meaning, or the critical museology school that questions the presence of exotic items. But Chiara's presentation, of course, has made it very clear, as well as Gustau's presentation. They have raised the whole problem of the whole issue of which narrative is out there, how can we revert the logics of a museum, whether the restitution of the object is needed or not. And this is a topic that is being debated in many museums. And of course, it has an important political connotation. I believe that the Tropen Museum was taken away a public funding because the extreme right-wing party in office considered that their narrative attacked the very cement of the Dutch society. As well as, well, Monica's presentation has been very interesting because Monica has speak about the appropriation of objects or immaterial objects or designs, as Monica said. So this would be a new wave, one could say, a new stage. Very interesting. All the topics that you've raised have been very interesting. Thank you very much. And somehow this misappropriation of designs or objects are taking advantage of this new age cool approach of certain exotic looks. Being left wing sometimes makes us feel attracted to exotic things or indigenous designs. But of course, the first question goes to Chiara because I think she has to leave in 10 minutes. So I'm going to ask her.
Oh, I can stay a bit
a few
longer.
questions.
I have moved my dinner, so I can stay a bit longer.
Okay, no, llavors no
Okay,
tenim tant...
then we're not in a rush. But still, the first questions go to her. Anyway, so you talked about the failure of the museum's decolonization, but in museums, more than in other social fora, more than in other human groups or social groups, well, in museums there are important debates, deep debates, as you've said, about whether we have to return objects back to their origin or not. You also gave us an example about Italy, where the decolonization process is rather poor, even if the Pecorini has a very anti-colonial narrative. Museography doesn't help in this sense. Not to speak about Spain, because except a few initiatives, decolonization process is zero. The Museo de América here in Spain still has this narrative of the Encuentro 1992. Yeah, let's all be cool. And colonizers were like researchers that wanted to understand how America was, right? But we wish here in Spain to be at the level of the Terburen Museum or the museum that you mentioned before, right? Other museums that are down the path of somehow returning these items, or the New Zealand Museum that aims at returning many objects to the indigenous peoples. So the question is the following. There are different lines and perspectives. So when you refer to the failure, I don't think that one can speak about a general failure of museums. The Canadian museums, for example, have reached important rates of autochthonous peoples are now part of the decision-making processes in museums when they exhibit traditional items. But of course, there are many nuances, many different museums, many different forms of museums. So I don't know. What do you think about this point? This is rather a reflection, not so much a question, right? The question would be, don't you think there are different perspectives, different approaches, and perhaps some museums have placed this debate at the center? And the following question would be, because Gustavo could also answer it, right? What do you think about the devolution of items? Is it only a mask? I believe it is in many cases. The devolution of these items is for the picture. Very little objects go back to its origins. In France, in the Netherlands, there's been a whole debate. Even Macron said that they had to return pieces, but I think it's a mask. It's just for the picture because many items are never going to be returned. when in fact in Canada or in the US or in New Zealand, it's impossible thanks to judicial court rulings. So here comes the two reflections for you, Chiara.
Yeah, well, thank you, Xavier. I mean, I use the notion of failure in the sense of queer studies and Jacob Alberston, meaning sort of an essential, so a basic lack, the lack of sort of adequate means to, well, lack of, like, sorry, lack is not the right term, sort of the impossibility of fully making it right, the impossibility of a complete representation, which doesn't mean that we do not have to continue trying to sort of repair the colonial. By failure, I mean that all kinds of, in a way, this is a very, I mean, I encounter it in my work in museums, I encounter it in my work inside, in the university, while we're trying to make it a more diverse places. Those struggles are are extremely complex struggles. I myself, you know, I sometimes, you know, before doing this presentation, I was wondering whether my use of the sort of intervention by the Abanza might be seen as a form of appropriation, and whether I have the right to speak about a number of issues as a sort of, yeah, I would say almost white woman. At the same time, I think we need to risk such, I mean, I call them failure again in the specific sense of queer studies as something which is both sort of a trap, a problem, something that is contested, a move that is contested and will always be contested, and at the same time is sort of it's a move sort of towards the future, to move the debate. And when I talk about failure, I mean that what I think has been particularly productive, and you see this very clearly in the case of Berlin and the Humboldt Forum, are the debates and the contestations. So in a way, it's when sort of, for example, new exhibitions on colonialism are always contested, because those representations always fail, you know, they fail to repair in a way what has been smashed. And at the same time, again, that failures opens up a series of debates and contestations that move the debate further, that create more awareness, for example, and move the debate further. So this is, for example, in the case of the debate in the Netherlands about the Dutch Santa Claus, some people say that, you know, some people might argue that not much has been achieved in terms of sort of more equality and justice in the Netherlands through these particular contestations. And yet I think it has the sort of that debate as sort of managed to frame the question of racism and heritage and racism in a completely different way. Sorry, if I've taken a bit too much. The question of mask is a facade. Yes, in a way, of course, politics. I mean, Macron, I mean, I think there is no way we cannot, I mean, not recognize the violence of colonial appropriation. So I think politicians have to do some form of recognitions, like, and at the same time, I think there is again, also here, there is a space, sort of a space for politics, for applying political tactics, so that we turn even political, some sort of what some might call political opportunism into an opportunity and opening for doing something with return and restitution.
There is another question for you, Chiara. Ricard Cunesa asks, he says the problem is not only a state problem, it's also a European problem. Do you think that the European Union should also have a policy on the topic? What actions should the European Union push forward in the topic?
Well, I mean, I do think the European Union should make this into sort of a core point of its cultural policies. At the same time, I see the difficulties, and if you, for example, even though I see the difficulties, if you, for example, look at the place of colonialism in the, for example, the House of European History in Brussels, it's basically it's non-existent, and it's well, let's not go there. So it's I imagine with sort of Spanish colleagues and the ways in which Frankism and fascism has been narrated in that museum is simply astonishing. Well, I'm not now speaking sort of to what I imagine some of you might be thinking, or at least what I sort of what I was thinking. The way I reacted to that kind of representation coming from an Italian experience of a certain kind of fascism. So I do think it's really important. At the same time, at the moment, it's an uphill battle, because sort of the current, I would say, hegemony within EU cultural policy is something different. At the same time, I think that in a way, there are some openings again, which are due to the fact that EU cultural policy is a very complex field, and it works also in part through civil societies and sort of memory initiatives such as the European Observatory on Memory. So I think that this very sort of complex multi-level governance way of working of EU cultural policies might allow in the future for sort of a change in the current hegemony, which is I think very problematic, particularly in the ways in which it is represented by the House of European History.
Sí, certament. La Casa d'Unió, la Casa d'Història Europea no és un exemple.
Yes, of course, European history is not a very good example of all this in many senses. There are great differences. Now let's go to another speaker. But before that, let me tell you that there are some gaps and some question marks. But of course, there is a lot of distance. Belgium, for example, has started the process of reflection. Holland, France, minimally, but Spain continues denying and not considering even that they have committed an act of colonialism, not only in Africa, but also in America. When they talk about colonialism, and it's been existing for many years, they're unable to recognize this. And if they are unable to recognize this, it's difficult to go further. We will continue, but we have other questions now for Gustau, for example. Gustau, who has given us another perspective. I had a question, but there are other questions from the public, and my question for Gustau is the following. You have placed on the table something which is always very interesting. Why Spain? I don't know if it was because of Franco, but while other countries were committing plundering, but at least you form some collections, debatable, but collections still. Why is this lack of interest from Spain in creating collections, not even to justify this colonialism? What is your point of view, Gustavo? You were saying that they were just making some destruction. And it's true, we have very few collections from Equatorial Guinea and very few from America also. But now we're talking about Africa. Why do you think is that? Because it happened very late, lack of interest in the process during the Franco regime for any cultural good in this sense? So that was the first question. And also, you can answer this question, and then I have other questions from the public. Okay, so I think that the destruction responds to a model of colonialism, which is very paternalistic and missionary. And you see the culture and religion of the Guinean people. In the case of Morocco, it's different, but in the case of Guinea, it is seen as something that has been completely destroyed. So we encounter a paradox. Those objects with patrimonial meaning are destroyed, and the Europeans buy objects manufactured by the Hausa, which do not have any meaning. If we see Wallapop, there are many objects from this, and these are objects manufactured by the Hausas African art, and the Europeans were hanging this in the dining room. Some of them are made of ivory and have a specific value, but they don't have a symbolic value for the people from Guinea. It's a piece of art without any value. And I think this is very much related to this obsession, taking into account that Spain did not have any colonial officials in Spain. And those in charge of the administration were the military, and those in charge of the relations with the population were missionaries, which means that the cultural violence of the Spanish colonies was especially strong compared to Cameroon, which was German, or Nigeria, that belonged to other colonial powers. We cannot hear Roigè Xavier. His microphone is off. I had more questions, but I'm told from the organizers that we will have to finish by 8:30. So a question for Mónica now. Also, a question about the role and responsibility that Ricard Conesa says from the public, those consumers in front of these practices of appropriation. What is the role of consumers? Well, it is clear that as consumers, we have a lot of power. We are seeing this during this pandemic. We have more rights as consumers than as citizens. And also in the case of these objects, can you hear me? Is Mónica asking? Yes, you can. We can hear her. And in the case of this indigenous works of art, part of our responsibility, of course, is also as consumers and responsible consumers, whether there is an agreement with these peoples in order to trade with their art, to trade with their symbols, whether these symbols are public, and if these symbols are private. I think that this is already happening. And in my opinion, we want to have this type of information. For example, we have some stamps with a certificate saying that this is being traded with the agreement of the indigenous community producing this product. And I think that in the end, and we have also seen that during the pandemic, trading with this indigenous art is also an important source of income for this indigenous community. They are trying to trade through the internet, and we should not stop consuming this, but we have to know whether this is happening under fair conditions and these communities are making profit from it, or whether we are repeating a pattern and this is being produced in the other side of the world, far away from the indigenous people and without these people knowing this. So I think that this is the responsibility by the consumer also. That's all I wanted to say as far as this question. We are all very tired. Maybe we should call it a day, Mónica says. Roger cannot hear me. Well, thank you very much. In any case, we're out of time, but there are two questions from the public. If you allow me, we will ask these questions if the organizers allow me, and then we will end by 8:30. There is a question from Ricard Conesa and saying, Gustau, the restitution of heritage, it's a necessary action for people from Guinea know their history, and why is not an interest in this? Well, these are two different questions, sorry. Gustau. We cannot hear Gustau because his microphone is off. Now, okay, let's see. The restitution. I think that sometimes we are presenting like magical solutions that we want to apply to all context. And I don't think this is the case. The first problem we have with restitution is who are we restituting? Who is the owner of this? Is it the state from Equatorial Guinea? Is the Fang culture? When we talk about small indigenous communities, it's very clear. And the restitution sometimes is simpler. It was very easy to restitute an obelisk, which was in a specific place, and we return it to this specific place, but with a private object, private property. Restitution, unless you can identify the people, is much more complex. So the first question is that there is a lack of people to whom we should address this object restitution. Restitution is not value unless there is an agreement with the one welcoming these objects. It's like kicking the object and leaving the object in the air. No, in order for restitution to happen, we should have an agreement with someone, and in the case of Guinea, this has not existed. Guinea has a non-existent cultural policy. It does not exist in practice. And since the independence, it has not existed. And of course, this makes things more difficult. This is something that has to be taken into account. For the moment, we have a huge task, which is to preserve the heritage. Of course, we should not continue the things we have done so far, decontextualizing, and the restitution. Well, I think that it has to come from an agreement with the owners. And right now, if there is no an owner, restitution is very difficult. And the last question, and some points have already been answered, so please be as brief as possible. Adria says that in the case of Guinea, the cultural destruction and the impossibility to restore the heritage questions what to do with the different collections of the Spanish state. What should we do with it? I think that you have already answered. Yes, I have already answered. The question is to see, well, I think what we have to do now is to preserve this art and not to degrade it, as it happens with some exhibitions and some museums. But beyond that, I think that we have to organize a restitution without the counterpart willing to do that. Okay, very well. I don't know if anybody would like to say anything. Just to conclude, Chiara, you have the floor.
Yeah, sorry, if I can answer, because I just wanted to say something in response to Gustau. I think there is partly a misrepresentation of what restitution and return are about. It's not an easy formula at all. But first of all, I think the fact that it's not easy, and that's, colonial destruction have indeed produced like an incredible and long-lasting destruction. I think that the fact that it's not easy doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it, because it's just. And this is the question of principles. But on the practical question, I think that, for example, the Savoy report says that, in a way, the question of restitution and return is basically, it's an open question, and it is the beginning of a project that we have to build that will take different forms, which should be relational forms, so in dialogue with the different sort of actors in the field. So I think it's a question that we have to ask ourselves, but is, in a way, we are at the beginning of asking that question. But the fact that it's difficult shouldn't mean that we shouldn't do it and just keep on doing what we have always been doing.
Yes, completament d'acord.
I completely agree with you, Chiara, says Gustau. Anything else, Mónica? No, okay. Well, I think that with this last question named by Chiara, we can close the day, the session. These are complex issues, very complex. And we have seen by listening to Mónica that we're not only talking about objects, but also the appropriation of this heritage. And thank you very much for everything. And many, many questions. But the fact that it's complicated, the fact that it takes and raises many questions doesn't mean, as Chiara said, that we shouldn't approach it in depth. Also, because there are three questions. There is a debate, a political debate, which in the end is the most important one. And that's an important question, but there is debate about what to do with these collections from the point of view of their presentation, because it's not easy, and what to do. And thirdly, how the public, the European public, with the different political changes that are happening, with an increase of xenophobia and racism, how, in a way, the museums and the institutions can provide an answer to these questions, and in order for them not to fail. So this failure, it's also a question which is important when we talk about failure. And this is a question I was asking. It happens in anthropology. Sometimes the failure has been in communicating the importance of this to the society and how important is the restitution of everything that we have taken, which has enriched our heritage. Thank you very much. We could go until 9, 10 o'clock at night in the evening, or even later, because all your contributions are very enriching. But I think, I don't know what time we have to finish, but it's almost 8:30. Well, in any case, it's 8:30. It's a good time to finish. Good night. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here, and we continue tomorrow. Bye.
Adéu, bona nit.
Bona nit.
Aviam, ara s'ha de tallar la connexió per YouTube.